Joining us now on the line from Montreal, Quebec, Marie McAndrew. She is professor at the University of Montreal and the chair there in ethnic relations. Ça va bien, madame, ce soir?
I'm very well, thank you.
Glad to hear it. Could you please start off by just describing in general terms what is contained in the proposed legislation that is causing so much controversy these days?
Basically, it's reiterating the basic guideline of reasonable accommodation. So it does not preclude any accommodation of diversity, but it does say that regarding covering your full head and figure, that normally services in public institutions are given with a visage découvert, with your free
face?
Yes, your face, that people can see your face. And, but there are some exceptions. But whenever you want to make an accommodation, you have to be careful that the communication is not hindered, neither is public security, public safety, and overall functioning of the institution.
Okay, now you have no doubt been eating, sleeping, breathing all of the Quebec media during the course of the debate over this issue. Would you say, generally speaking, more people are in favor of this bill or against it?
Okay, I think when there was the banning of, they asked this woman to leave her French course in Cégep Saint-Laurent, there was a wide consensus. You could see it also in the opinion poll, if I remember well, 95% of Quebec, up to 80% of the rest of Canada, because this specific test case was a very clear one when the person had for 6 months been negotiating with the Cégep. There was good faith from their part, and she was not at all accommodating, and finally they had to take it to the decision. Now, once they adopted the bill, I would say that there was a little less support, although it's a strong majority support, because some people are worried that a law is different from a case-by-case settlement. And especially they had a second case recently where actually the girl was integrating very well into her French class and there was no problem. So actually some opinion makers, such as in La Presse, for example, they say actually maybe a bill is not such a good idea. So I would make a difference between the general agreement that it is legitimate in some occasion to not allow the wearing of the burqa, especially in courses where communication is central, and making a law for it.
Marie, what's your personal view on this bill? Do you favor it?
I favor it in a way because I think it's a good thing to reiterate some of the basic values and some of the norms that are the general framework, the room for maneuver, for reasonable accommodation. But I was a little worried to see how quick some civil servants were to take the bill. The bill doesn't say you will never accept a burqa in a class. It says normally you should not accept it, but you have to prove it causes an obstacle to communication or public safety or the functioning of the institution. So I was a little worried when I saw them coming so quick at Pointe-Claire the other day, and in a case where nobody was actually complaining that they would apply the law without negotiation. Because my reading of the law was really that it was simply stating what the Supreme Court has been telling us for until 1985, and especially in the area of services until 2000, which is that whenever there is a case where there may be a conflict between the religious rights and some basic other rights or some type of functioning of the institution, what they call the undue hardship part of it, then we should get into a negotiation. And if the institution can prove that actually they've tried in good faith, but still the religious requirement is a hindrance to their pursuing their mandate, then they are allowed to refuse it. So in a way, what the bill says is only that. But I'm surprised that some civil servants took it and saw it as a bill saying, as soon as you see a burqa, without even analyzing the case, this law says the burqa is not allowed, because that's not what the bill actually says.
I see. Okay, let me read you an excerpt from the Montreal Gazette on how they reported this very recently. Excuse me. Proposed legislation that bans the niqab from government offices, the education system, and healthcare reflects a broad consensus in Quebec that equality of the sexes is paramount, rights experts said yesterday. But any further step to purge religious symbols from the public sphere would intrude on individual rights, said constitutional lawyer Julius Gray. We should not follow France into secular radicalism, he said. I believe that is too dogmatic, and I do not think we should make secularism a religion. So I want to ask you whether you think secularism is becoming a religion in Quebec.
No, I wouldn't say. I'd say public opinion is pretty split. You do have a strong component of people who are longing for a type of French-type secularism. But in the opposition to reasonable accommodation, you have both. You also have people who actually are longing to go back to the Quebec traditional values where Catholicism was dominant. So those people, although they are not in the pluralistic camp, they are certainly not proponent of the French model. And then you have, you know, it's difficult to say if it's one third, but you have a good third of a good other third of the population of the public opinion who is more aiming towards a pluralist model. But I would agree with you that maybe we are more sensitive to the necessity of making the pluralist model compatible with gender equity and other rights. I think in this area, the Quebec discussion and reflection, which started in the 1990s with the policy statement on immigration and integration of 1990s, and has given rise to at least 10 public documents of both from the community, from the Quebec human rights, from the school boards. There's a wide reflection in Quebec, which was very innovative in the 90s. I would say now almost everybody say that multiculturalism has to be revisited to make it more compatible with other rights and especially gender equality. But we have 20 years of deep reflection in this issue. So I wouldn't say necessarily the French model is that popular. But there are strong components of the French model. But what we call the Quebec model is really a third way between uncritical multiculturalism, which I'm not saying is the actual and present policy of the federal government, because it's no more the fact, but traditionally what we would call uncritical multiculturalism and the French very strict Republican model.
Let me get your sense about how you think, I mean, you've explained how you feel Quebec has reacted to this bill. How do you feel the rest of Canada has reacted to these moves by the Quebec government?
Okay. I think in a way it's linked to what I just said. I think the rest of Canada has not really followed the last 20 years, all the development that have happened in Quebec in trying to define this third way between critical, uncritical multiculturalism and uncritical French republicanism, if I can say. And I must say also that it has been done through a lot of communication with immigrant groups, and I say especially Muslims, because we do have a specific Muslims population, newcomers from North Africa, heavily, people who have come heavily from having flew during the time of fundamentalism in North Africa. So they used to be a very strong proponent of French model among those people. So there was a lot of interaction. I remember myself, I was very active in the 1995 controversy about the girl who had a simple scarf in school. And the major opponent to that were people from North Africa. I was treated as a white liberal who doesn't know what's happening in North Africa, and you should shut up, Miss McAndrew, because you've never been thrown cyanide in your face because you went to the beach. By a North African woman. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I would say that this has been overlooked totally by the ROC. So the funny thing now is that whenever we hear from support about the Quebec bill, it's usually from rather right-wing people. I know there's been even impressive support even for Hérouville declaration from the rest of Canada, a lot of emails. Myself, sometimes I receive email from the right-wing people where the issue of refusing uncritical multiculturalism is linked to anti-immigration sentiment and sometimes, funny enough, anti-French or anti-black. So the type of, all right, orange right. And on the other hand, the left or the center left tend to say, oh, this is only tribalism, and that's a proof that Quebec is a bunch of tribals. And they overlook the fact that it's not a French-Canadian thing, that it's actually a wide consensus all across the, the language group, and especially among the new French community, which is composed of people from different religion and different languages. Mm-hmm. So it's funny because we see that as really a third way, and this position, I'm not speaking about the bill especially, but the overall thing that you need to reconcile multiculturalism with other rights and to put some limits to diversity. We see that as a rather progressive endeavor that is done with a lot of cooperation with people from those groups who are themselves worried.
I understand, Marie. Let me jump in for a second and ask you about, I understand what the government bill is, I understand the third way that you're talking about. I want to ask you about the Parti Québécois, because they are proposing something I gather they call the Charter of Secularism. That would bar civil servants from wearing religious symbols, for example, the hijab for Muslims, a yarmulke for Jews, a cross for Christians. What's your view of that approach?
Okay. I think the problem we're running in Quebec those last 3 years since Dumont started the reasonable accommodation controversy is that we have had the instrumentalization of this issue for purely political purposes. Actually, Pauline Marois is the person, she was the Minister of Education when they published the policy statement of 1998 on diversity in school, in which the third way is perfectly described and which has been the basis of the training of school principal those last 12 years in Quebec. And she knows better. So I don't even think she believes what she says. I'm going to be very
okay, so why is she doing it?
For political reason. And you can see why there's a split with the Bloc Québécois. The Bloc Québécois and Gilles Duceppe won't go with her on that. Actually, if you look at their brief to the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, it's very the so-called third way Quebec. They're not in favor of banning religious symbol, except in very strategic positions such as policemen or judges, which I think can be argued pretty seriously. But actually, there's a split now in the nationalist movement, not to even mention the Québec Solidaire or even the Quebec Federation of Women, because any nationalist party who still has a sensitivity of integration and participation knows perfectly that we're at exactly a cutting edge where we're starting to get minority people in the civil service force, because there's a lot of retirement, so now there's a lot of jobs. Also because the Muslim and North African are heavily Francophone.
Okay, but so let me ask you about these bans.
I want to finish just a little. It just means that, it's very important I finish this. It means that those people, they are entering the public service now. And if we adopt such a ban, it means that we will bring them back out, which is really not the thing you should do.
No, I take your point. But I'm wondering whether you think these bans represent some kind of secular backlash to the reasonable accommodation philosophy which Quebec had been taking up to now.
Yes, certainly. I'm going to be a little cynical. My only hope is that historically, since 1970, Parti Québécois is always much more accommodating to minorities when they are in power than when they are in opposition. And I would even say they usually have much more leadership towards minority than the Liberal Party, given that the minority used to be a captive clientele, a voting clientele captive of the Liberal. So if you look over the last 30 years, the major moves are usually made by Parti Québécois. So I don't know, I'm just hoping that maybe this is basically, a very short-sighted political, not even with a small p, political with a small p move.
Okay, let me jump in here because I want to talk. You mentioned a couple of moments ago about this commission that was established in Quebec a number of years ago, and I want to read a comment from the National Post about that. A government commission presided by philosopher Charles Taylor and sociologist Gérard Bouchard, which reported in 2008, briefly calmed things down. It revealed striking distortions in the way instances of accommodations had been reported in Quebec. The authors also tried to put their finger on why Quebecers had been so consumed by perceived and often exaggerated threats to their culture. Messrs. Bouchard and Taylor prescribed greater openness to immigrant cultures. Quote, "The identity inherited from the French-Canadian past is perfectly legitimate, and it must survive because it is a source of diversity, but it cannot alone define the Quebec identity and must take into account the other identities present in a spirit of interculturalism." And I wonder whether 50 years after the Quebec Revolution, there is still a degree of cultural insecurity in Quebec.
Certainly there is. I don't know if it's that much linked to religion. I mean, it used to be linked more with language. It seems to be a mutation of insecurity because actually you would believe that the Muslim population are the perfect immigrant. They were selected by the Quebec government, by the way, because Quebec selects all their independent immigrants. So they correspond exactly to the type of immigrants we want. They are highly skilled, they speak French, they're young, they're mobile, unquote, everything you can dream of. And all of a sudden, then you see this jumping of the debate from language to religion. It seems that there is a part of insecurity that is looking until something to jump on to express itself. I would nevertheless make a few qualifications. Number one is that this part of the Bouchard-Taylor report was aimed most at the identity crisis. I think a lot of the reasonable accommodation debate is not about the identity crisis, although part of it and part of the importance that is given by the media and the general public is, but still there is there's some reality in institution. And what we saw at Bouchard-Taylor was that people who were not in contact with diversity, especially people from outside Montreal, were expressing more this type of identity insecurity, while people who came from the institution who are in contact with immigrants, such as school or CLSC, you know, health services, or municipalities, or ordinary citizen NGOs, would not discuss so much the identity insecurity and would discuss more how do we find a common ground in institution. And I would say both majority and minority were coming back to the issue about how can we accommodate diversity with respecting gender equity, because this is not a preoccupation of the majority, ethnic majority in Quebec. It's a preoccupation, I would say, even more of the minorities, because they're the ones who have to make this type of balance, although we do have some sexist element in our religion and culture. I mean, every religion and culture has sexist element. So I would make this qualification. There is a real debate about, and an overinflation of reasonable accommodation debate as it relates to identity. But there is also a genuine concern shared by many groups about the balance between religious diversity and other value. We discuss a lot of gender equity, but I'd say in school, for example, the main discussion is not so much on gender equity, such as critical thinking. And you have the same problem in the rest of Canada. I mean, you had a very famous case in BC, where the Three-Book case, where some religious fundamentalists wanted to ban in schools some reading books where we had the homocentric, I mean, you know, both same-gender parents, textbooks for students, and not textbooks, but small reading books. And the court of BC said that your religious freedom does not allow you to censor the freedom of others. So I think there's a real debate about religious rights and their balance with other rights.
I think just before I ask you the next question, I should correct myself. I think on the last question I said the Quebec Revolution. I meant, of course, the Quiet Revolution that took place 50 years ago.
Obviously.
Yes. Let me ask you about one of the recommendations that came out of that Taylor-Bouchard report, and it was to remove the crucifix that is hanging behind the Speaker's chair at the l'Assemblée nationale, the National Assembly in Quebec City. They had an all-party resolution, and they decided to keep that crucifix in place. Now, again, for consistency's sake, was that the right decision?
No, absolutely not. As I said, it shows you that there's a good, what Bouchard-Taylor revealed, for me at least, was not so much that there was, you know, a good bunch of people who were longing for a French model. This I knew for a long time. But what the Bouchard-Taylor Commission really brought to light was that there were some traditionalist, proponent of traditionalist Quebec culture who regret the time where there was some type of predominance of Catholicism. And those people, were, among which was Monseigneur Ouellet, for example, were actually not always so much in opposition to reasonable accommodation. I would say for people of, if your audience knows a little bit about the Muslim world, they would consider the religious minority as dhimmi, like the Muslim would use to consider them, you know, protected second-class citizen. So in a way, a lot of the position of some of the traditionalist Quebec, you know, Catholic Quebecers are, we should have place for all religion in our schools and our society as long, and institution, as long as Catholicism is predominant. So I think basically the Charest government, they had decided before the Bouchard-Taylor Commission even tabled their recommendation that they would pacify both ends. So on the one end, even before Bouchard-Taylor tabled their report, Christine Saint-Pierre made public that she would make the modification of the Quebec Charter so gender equity would have, so in quote-unquote, prescience, but that's not true. It doesn't work like that, but that's the way she phrased it, on religious rights. So this was to pacify the more, you know, more French model proponent. And at the same time, before even the recommendation were studied, they kept the crucifix in the National Assembly. This was to pacify this bunch of people who are longing for more predominance of Catholicism and traditional value. And this was a real surprise because those people had been silent, extremely, you know, low-key since the Quiet Revolution. So that you really see a society which is split not in half, but in three bunches, I would say. And funny enough, the alliances are interesting because you do find minority people, especially religious minority people, who are ready to ally with some of those traditionalists because they are at least more open to keep religion in the public space than the French model, Jacobinist proponent model. So it's an interesting thing to study, really.
Marie, we have about 2 minutes left. I want to ask you one last thing. Do you think Quebec's, some would say concern, some would say obsession with its identity, sometimes spills over into racism or at the very least xenophobia?
I think it does sometimes. I don't think, I think the reasonable accommodation controversy 2 years ago showed some of this instance. I don't necessarily think that the Burqa case I don't think at all that the Burqa case at Cégep Saint-Laurent, one of the most multicultural and multiculturally sensitive institutions of Quebec at the college level was the case. And I think it's a clear case where people negotiated in good faith. But I do think that there is some instrumentalization by politicians of some identity preoccupation. But I think English Canada should also look at the fact that those issues are happening in English Canada and they don't necessarily consider their a symbol of racism. And I'll also add that not looking at all at the compatibility of accommodation with other rights can be a form of racism. It's like, you know, those people, we don't mind if their rights are not protected, that's their culture and their religion. So they can be a part of racism in uncritical multiculturalism that I sometimes see applied, not all the time, but in some institutions, for example, in schools that I know, oh, it's okay for those girls not to have the same rights as other girls because they are Muslim, for example. I hear that sometimes, not that blatantly, but at least we accommodate their rights because they are Muslims. And I think that racism can have a lot of form, and this is also a form of racism.
Marie McAndrew, thanks so much for joining us on the line from Montreal, Quebec tonight. Bonsoir.
Thank you very much. Good night.